Hey, PerfBytes listeners, before you get started on today's episode, we'd like to mention the generous support of our sponsor, Flood.io. Imagine your load test plan runs great with just 10 threads, but now you need 100,000 users. Distributed load testing seems like a good idea, right? But now you're wrestling with out-of-memory errors and blocked RMI ports, and your load generators outnumber the target servers for JMeter. You are throwing knives in the dark with limited feedback and Mandralic reporting. Say hello to Flood.io. Launch Flood test using JMeter or Gatling, view and share test results in real time, scale out your own grid across the globe in minutes. Flood.io, distributed load testing for everyone.
It's time for PerfBytes.
What the is PerfBytes?
The fourth square meal of the day. Simple like PerfBytes. Waffles, microwave ready. Blah blah blah. Blah blah.
Add nutritional value to your brain.
It's time for PerfBytes with your hosts Mark Tomlinson and James Pulley. PerfBytes. Whatever.
Hey, it's time for PerfBytes once again, everyone in PerfBytes land, PerfBytes listeners. And, of course, this is the continuous edition of PerfBytes because, of course, it's happening all the time, even when you didn't know it was happening by default in the background, and we were always automatically creating PerfBytes episodes and recording them and posting them and making them more and posting them and posting them more. Right, James?
Yes.
Exactly. The usual episode of PerfBytes, of course, is brought to you by your ubiquitously iterating and failure-averse hosts, Mark Tomlinson and James Pulley. And our guest host this episode is our good friend and I would say PerfBytes originator back in Beaverton at the International House of Pancakes, Carlos Chidiac. Carlos, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys.
You remember all those breakfasts that we had at the International House of Pancakes so many years ago?
I missed them. We need to do one more.
Well, this is...
By the way, Carlos, Gabby asks about you.
Say hello to Gabby when we go back out there.
So, yes, welcome, Carlos. And today's topic, not crazily, ironically, continuous, is the topic of continuous performance testing, which right out of the gate here, James, I'm going to just toss the question right to you. What is continuous performance testing? What does it mean?
You want it in theory or in practice or in observation?
Observation, then theory, then practice.
Observation. Developers rule the universe. We can control everything by having all of these automated processes inside the development space.
Okay.
Theory, it's a continuous process of measurement and assessment, including continuous build, deploy, and test on an automated basis, on potentially even a daily or an hourly basis. I think SOSTA builds 8 builds a day in kind of a continuous integration and test process. So that's kind of the theory behind it, where speed has an advantage.
Yeah.
Like if you're running from the cops or something. In practice, well, things are automated that the developers can control, and things that they can't control, sometimes they allow people from the outside to come in to provide inputs, but only if it doesn't reduce their speed.
So it really does stem from a sort of developer view of the world, right? So if you're a RUP shop or a Microsoft shop that was really, really dominated by seeing code, everything is code and code is king, or more mature agile shops, right? This is going to be sort of their view of doing everything continuously. So it can mean that once you automate something, then you never have to think about it again, which I think is also a big mistake, right? That automation doesn't require maintenance. I think really the continuous performance part of it is that you're no longer just going to be an isolated part, a separate team that happens once. The continuous nature of this continuous performance testing is that it happens frequent, very frequent. Now you have, like you say, 8 builds a day in a continuous way. And the other part, meaning the continuous nature, is that it's automated and unattended. So it happens by default. Like you don't have to sign up a team to go do a bunch of testing, right, James? This is automated scripts that you plug into the continuous integration.
And that, Mark, that really gets to the theory behind testing. Can you automate everything to get a comprehensive view of system performance? if you look at continuous integration, test, deploy, with all this continuous model, the answer is, well, of course, you can automate everything. But as we all know from a testing universe, you can't automate 100%. And that's why I say that this is really a very sophisticated smoke of the system, but there's still other questions that are to be answered.
You mean like a smoke test of the system when you say smoke?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Not actually smoking or creating a smoke, like lighting a disc on fire.
Although there's a story about that, but we'll go into that later. Carlos?
I'm saying it's according who's listening to you. They might take a different view. If it is smoke, they might be looking at smoke coming out of the systems.
If you're in Northern California, you might think that smoke has a different meaning.
No, that's Colorado, Mark.
Okay, that's right. It's legal in Colorado and Washington, so that'll be good. So keep in mind, again, what makes continuous performance testing the continuous part is that it happens frequently and it's unattended and automated and it's integrated. I think we all agree that the critical thinking portion of a test design, we can't automate the creative process that happens through, the speed of the human brain doing analysis. But you can automate behaviors, you can automate steps of a process, you can automate the execution and checking of things in the system. So when we say automated testing, particularly performance testing, the design and the meaning and the analysis of performance is separate from automating the process. But with that in mind, there's two other things to keep in mind. One is that there is a flow from the creation of the code to production, and I'll call that the promotional flow. So you're continuously creating new code, testing that code, and promoting it all the way into production. There's many, many steps along the way. If you're in continuous performance testing, you're going to sort of automate performance testing all the way along that flow of promotion. The other thing to keep in mind is you're continuously getting feedback. So you do APM or monitoring in production, and you bring that data back into QA, back into development and to the business. So there's this flow of promotion and feedback and promotion and feedback. Even if you're not automating it, even if you're not aware of it, if the production guys are unwilling to tell you what the average response time is in production, you'd be upset because it's like, I'd like to know that. So if they block the feedback, that's a bad thing. So,
and Mark, this is a classical failure of automation and performance today is that break in the feedback loop.
Yeah.
Where you may have heard the term checkbox automation or checkbox performance testing, where the goal is to automate or to run the performance test, but the value of what comes out of it is either ignored or not passed back to the appropriate individuals.
A lot of the things, speaking of, sort of automating things in the build and delivery, and you mentioned the word speed, James. If you can automate something, you can accelerate it. And if you can accelerate it, especially in Agile and DevOps world, they like this phrase, fail faster and fail forward and fail and fix, which if you're really bad at development, you need to fail a lot. And, to some extent, some employers are willing to pay you to learn on the job. If you're lucky enough to be able to fail all over the place but not get fired, then this process could work for you because you can fail really fast and you can fix it really fast. But here's James Perf Rant on continuous testing and DevOps and devs in Agile.
It's time for a Perf Rant.
Speed kills. Yeah, I said it. Speed kills. In order to achieve high speed, you first have to be competent at low speed, and then you can crank up the volume. This continuous performance testing stuff isn't all that it's cracked up to be. When speed is the goal instead of quality being the goal, you're going to get speed. If you incentivize speed, that's what you're going to get. If you're in such an environment like this and you pull the brakes, oh my God, you've stopped the momentum going forward, even if it's a catastrophic defect. And this is part of that whole DevOps paradigm. Notice in DevOps, there's no QA because QA slows everything down. People think, and that causes problems. It reduces the speed. And at its core, there's a checks and balances problem. When speed is the goal, any check against that speed, whether it's a quality check that says go, no go, that can be a problem. Now, what are the benefits here? In theory, we're shifting left. Oh my God, we're getting all the way down to the requirements, the user story level. We're going to be looking at unit testing as every piece of code is checked in. We've got every single piece of every single line of code instrumented. We can get response times off of it. And if it declines, we can say, no, you can't check it into the build and you can't go any further. In reality, devs rule the universe in a lot of organizations, and it is very, very, very difficult to pull that line that says, no, you can't integrate. As a tester, when the developer says, I are a developer, I can integrate, you can't tell me no. So you also get this issue that's actually very common in test automation, is automation for automation's sake. We're automating for speed, not for quality, just so we can move faster. So, that's my cynical view of the universe on this. I'd like to see people do it well on a slow basis first before they crank up the volume. And that's not always the case. You get people that just come in and say, we're moving to continuous integration, performance, and test, when heck, they've never been able to build an environment on an automated basis in the first place that actually works. Speed kills.
Excellent perf rant, James. Carlos, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in. You have been at some different customer accounts recently and witnessed stuff. So what's your take on this as well? Just the continuous part of it.
The continuous part, I totally agree with what James said and his rant. I back him fully. And the better the developer, the better the testing, but you always need testing or performance testing, because developers don't always do the right thing, or they wouldn't need us. And the mindset that they have as developers, that they don't need us. And that's why there's that clash between the two. And they're thinking continuous performance testing, trying to take us out of the way, like they don't need performance testing.
So they use automation as a way to get around actually doing testing. They just automate some checks, right? Yeah.
And in their mind, they're looking at the small side. Performance testing for them is unit testing. They're testing their code, how it's going to perform, and they think it's enough. And they don't do a good job thinking that won't affect the whole picture. It's a small piece of the whole puzzle. Performance testing, continuous performance testing is a great concept. To be able to do that, there's different levels that you would have to do, and people don't delve into it to be able to break it apart and say, okay, what can we do continuous performance testing on, how we can separate each level from the others. And that's where, a lot of companies fall victim to that, to the notion of continuous performance testing.
Yeah, so many developers test to what they built it to, rather than potentially to what the requirements were or the expected end user behavior is. And that's a decoupling. They're building their developer performance test to test their code as they built it versus the as expected in deployment.
Or, it's happy path testing, right? It's like, oh yeah, can it run 10 threads? Yeah, it runs 10 threads. Were the 10 threads perfectly serialized and every one extra one you added were slower, so the scale characteristic, even at 10 threads, is terrible? I invert things really. A lot of people say, well, testers, they're just wannabe developers. They're people who don't know how to code, so they want to be developers. Well, I turn it around. There may be developers, but the minute we start talking about kind of the complexities and sophistication of performance testing anyway, really, devs are guys who just want to learn more and more about code efficiency and learn how to make their code better.
I see that a lot of developers trying to understand what performance testing. I've seen that in many companies where I go and start talking to them, and they're they don't know. They want more information because they're out of that loop and they don't understand it, and they're living in their own world, and their own world is perfect.
Yeah.
For developers.
That's because, Carlos, you keep showing up and telling them they have an ugly baby.
It's according how you say it to them.
Yes, it's not the ugliest baby. So let's talk a little bit about how these automated continuous integration, continuous development. There's a great book actually by Jez Humble and Dave Farley called Continuous Delivery, and they're strong advocates of automation, but they also give a lot of good tips on what to avoid and the pitfalls and some of that. So check out the Continuous Delivery book. It's not about performance testing, but there is some good tips in there. But if I try to give some advice on where performance fits into this continuous thing, specifically different than the old way we've always been doing performance testing in a separate group. The first thing I'll say is there's going to be increased frequency. The continuous part of continuous performance testing means you're testing all the time. You're automating your test earlier in the dev process. Maybe you're doing small unit tests in the actual development environment. They're connected to the continuous integration automation. So the nightly build comes out, it builds an environment, and then your suite of JMeter scripts or a command line call into Load Runner's controller. You can run end-to-end the whole process. You can do all of that more frequently, multiple times a day, if not at least every night. And you're taking performance measurements all the time. And this is a big challenge, I think, James, that people get mistaken between measuring performance in an absolute 100% reliable, credible way once versus looking at relative performance measurements. And even if it's not the exact same production performance you're going to see, you can at least see that things are getting twice as slow, 3 times as slow, and just looking for relative change. So that absolute versus relative on a frequent testing basis, I think that's a good place for people to change their thinking around compared to old school performance testing, right?
As long as you are holding your reference platform as a constant, if you achieve changes from build to build, whether it's a positive or a negative, you at least have a strong basis for understanding how that works in a given set of given environment with a given set of initial conditions. As your initial conditions change, you're likely to get a smaller or a greater change, but you're still going to have a change. So that relative aspect is absolutely credible in terms of measuring. Now, if you're changing your initial conditions every single time, things go out the window. That's kind of like, voting in a dictatorship. You vote one man one time and then you're done versus voting every 2 to 4 years. So,
yeah. And it also brings us back to the argument about virtualization, which is another gotcha here.
Yeah.
If your dev environment is running on different hardware and different networks every other time, then the build is not quote-unquote measurable. Remember, even if you want relative measures to compare in a trend during a sprint, that's still if the initial conditions or the baseline environment is not the same every time, you can't compare apples and dump trucks. It just gets crazy out of hand. I did want to ask
Mark,
Carlos.
You can compare very large apples and dump trucks.
Okay.
Or very small dump trucks and apples. It's a scale thing.
Size matters. I think that's fine. That would Tina would say that. Hey guys, we're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsor, and then we'll come right back and talk about some more practical tips on how people can get started with continuous performance testing.
Hosting for PerfBytes.com has been provided by NewCo, New Centers of Excellence in Performance Engineering, PowerTest Professional Services, The Script Farm, LoadRunner by the Hour, Videratech, Cloud Architect, and No Load Test. For more information, go to www.newco.com or call 703-856-8187.
We're back now. You didn't hear that, did you?
Yeah, we did. It was very quick. It was speed versus quality.
It was speed versus...
Hey, I resemble that remark.
So I want to give everyone just some tips. I mean, if somebody's coming out of classic load testing, even a COE environment, and doing all sorts of work in performance testing in the lab, at some point you'll probably turn around and say, all right, what do I have to do to actually get going with this continuous performance testing stuff? And right off the bat, the first thing I will tell you is get tuned in to the nightly builds. If there's nightly builds or daily builds or twice a day, whoever's really doing the continuous integration or continuous delivery with Jenkins or Bamboo, get on board with them and take whatever performance test suite you have and figure out how to build a small version of it. Even if it runs shorter, like just runs for 30 minutes or just runs for 15 minutes.
And by the way, your outsourced vendor will tell you that they need to staff a body to watch the test.
Yeah.
You know what? This is part of that continuous integration, performance testing, and automation. No, they don't have to staff the body to watch the test.
They shouldn't have to. The investment goes into the intelligence of the automation, and actually even a warm body doesn't make sense when you've got platforms like Performance Center, latest stuff with LoadRunner, JMeter, BlazeMeter, SOSTA, all of the major tool vendors, open source and commercial, all have integrations now and plugins. So once you figure out how to take your scenarios and get them to work smaller in the dev environment, measure that trend over time, and be a little bit careful of testing in a scaled down environment. Maybe the data is not as big, maybe some things like that. And there could be virtualization issues, but this is where you start. Get your load test scenario jacked into the continuous integration system, Jenkins and Bamboo. And then that starts changing your world, your whole concept a little bit. First off, you might hold the developers accountable to what's called like a performance budget. I know a couple big customers that do this, where they test in a scaled environment. So they tell a developer, you're only allowed to use a maximum of 20% CPU, and they have a slice of the system. And there's some pros and cons to being able to do that effectively. But what I will say is it at least gets developers to be more conscious of the limitation of actual resources. The next thing I'll say is that your strategy for performance testing is going to have to change. So being the be-all, end-all gatekeeping, once you do a finished functional testing and then you do one large load test to give your stamp of certification and approval, those days are somewhat over. Remember this promotional flow that you've automated. When you're sitting in the middle of that release and you haven't given any feedback for the last 3 weeks of the iteration, and you say, well, I need 5 days of uninterrupted testing just to give you a go, no-go, the perception is there's a lot of pressure on you. This is not a hardening sprint at the end, right? You're doing stuff nightly. So my tip for this is that get your early insight into performance early, and then start looking at reprioritizing what tests you do for release. And release management says, look, I really want to see a baseline run and a soak test. And those are the only two that I really need to prove we can release. All your other test types, and James, you and I have done like 20-some test types at the Speed Geeking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so all those other test types might be more strategic. You could learn about them in an off cycle, maybe not blocking the release. It's like, well, if the stress test failed, we might still release the software because, no way we're going to see 10x throughput, in today in production. But if you're susceptible to point load, you might still do a spike test, just before you release. So think about changing that. And James, one other topic you bring up is this idea of social promotion. What is social promotion when promoting releases? What do you mean by that?
Well, we've all seen social promotion inside of high schools and middle schools. The 22-year-old in 8th grade, they're going to promote him to 9th grade because having a 23-year-old is kind of awkward. You get that concept in code as well. Well, he's been working on it so hard for so long, and, we just need to move it along. We'll fix it a little bit later, but we've got to get it in the build. It's critical functionality. No, don't do that. Don't socially promote. Put those hard gates at the end and actually enforce them. And that is difficult because developers, like I said, they like to rule the universe, and they will run over project managers. They will... they don't play politics very well, but they love to escalate, so they get their way. Yeah. And so this concept of social promotion, you've got to be very careful of. And there's some things that you can do, Mark, to kind of curb this. And I like to call it the pizza and beer event.
Yes.
Which is making friends with the developer and helping to facilitate and mentor them in the areas of performance testing and performance engineering. Because the more they know about your job and they know about your background, particularly if you're a true performance engineer, you usually have a development background of some nature.
Yeah.
They will gain a little bit more respect for your insight, and they are less likely to be dismissive of your input.
Oh, yeah.
And they can be receptive to it. And I found that after at least 3 beers, you're going to be on a very similar conversation, and they're going to be very receptive the following day after their headache wears off.
Yes, very, very true. Back on the topic of social promotion, even though you may socially agree over beers to release code, another tip you can have in this is that if you decide to let a release go that you know is not, up to par, it's not the greatest performance, as the performance protector of production, you may not block the release, but you may go to someone and say, well, I'm going to give you a pink slip that says you're on probation and we're going to do extra monitoring. We're going to throw some extra hardware at this particular app or this code, but we're going to give you 6 months to go back and prioritize and fix it. And you can this is how Facebook does it, right? So they'll let you put code into production, and if it's just a little bit too slow and it's still important to the business, they'll put it out, but they'll give you a time frame to fix it and do that kind of stuff. Another thing to think about as you move forward is that as you integrate, say, LoadRunner into a CI system, right? It's going to be a command line call to the WL running exe, and it's going to fire stuff up, have your auto analysis run with templates. It's going to generate everything after the test. And you might build some setup scripts that run in the beginning of the test and schedule those out so that they run before any other test. You may have to make all of your LoadRunner stuff or your SOSTA cloud test implementation work better with other developer testing tools. Now, in a Microsoft world, you may not have to do this because it's usually homogeneous kind of dev environment. But like working out tools with Grindr and JMeter for load, or Gatling is the other one that Tim talks us about with Flood.io. There's these other sort of dev tools, even homegrown tools in the dev environment. You may have to do things like wrapping something in a template virtual user and do that up in development with LoadRunner. Putting something that's just, you know how the tools are calibrated, so you can run 10 users in JMeter with think time and pacing, and you know how to kind of configure LoadRunner or SOSTA to kind of simulate the similar kind of load. So you may have to have a multi-tool strategy to go across these environments, but don't treat them like totally different things. I mean, the traffic that comes out of the tool might be slightly different, but you should become a master of how to make sort of these ends meet. There's not just one tool to rule them all. And I've also seen developers who just throw up on different tools, right? They'll just, oh, you don't use that? Oh, I don't use that tool. So you can get into these kind of turf wars, and you want to avoid that by being, whatever tool you use, that's fine. We'll integrate them together, pull your driver into our tool, and do that kind of stuff. It's going to be great, actually, from the LoadRunner 12 standpoint, the new community edition. You'll be able to move this controller and do different stuff in the dev environment without a lot of barriers, at least on the licensing side. That'll be really nice.
Yeah, but what you should agree with, Mark, with development is your common sampled basis.
Yeah.
No matter which tool you're looking at, whether it's JMeter, LoadRunner, Borland Performer, Gatling, Bob's Homegrown, Carlos's favorite tool, that whatever the sampled basis is consistent. I know in a lot of cases where I'm in a multi-tool environment, I actually go to the logs and I use some capabilities of the web servers to collect response times. And so no matter what tool is generating the load, I have a constant sampled basis for looking at performance.
Oh, yeah, totally. And Carlos, you just came off of a gig that was sort of doing more of a centralized, standardized tooling platform. That's very different than kind of the stuff we're talking here, right? That wasn't. What's your thoughts on that?
It's totally different. It's still in the old ways of doing it. They want to get to the CI, but they're coming in a different aspect. They were bringing all the tools so that the developers can pick and choose which performance tool they want to use and how they want to be able to implement a certain performance testing, not just performance, but even development and all the tools that you might have or you might need to do any development project you want to face.
Yeah. Now, how many different? There was an HP stack that you were implementing. Were there other tools to choose from to set up a project with those guys?
The first ones were HP, and then some of CA's tool sets. and we're going to introduce the IBM stack as well. So those are the major three. We were going to look also at other products such as JMeter and the ones that are free that you would be able to get.
Would you agree, Carlos, that environment is much more? You say sort of kind of the old way, but it's not just old; it's new. These guys are brand new,
right,
building this capability. They're going to get to CI, but they're going to do it in a much more formal, standardized kind of way, which is good for automation, and that's what they're doing. So
what I meant by the old way is that their approach is the old way, but by building that tool, it's going to force them to move to the contemporary or the thinking of continuous testing. The idea is continuous testing. How they're building it now was more of, okay, this is what we need. This is what we need to give our customers, but the capability is there so that they can move to the continuous performance.
And by having a more standardized set of tools to choose from, forcing the automation into CI or continuous delivery is easier to do because you only have 3 tools to plug in versus take a startup environment that's got, 16 different directions, 30 different teams going different ways, and they're all very dynamic. It's hard to sort of come up with an automated strategy it's not easy to do that.
As well as trying to consolidate all the work that has been happening across multiple teams so that they can share the information and be able to be more like the lesson learned. In other words, it is in one area, those tools, even though that you're using different tools, at least you have the lesson learned. Because it's the one that we were developing with was a huge undertaking for a big company.
Yeah. So this is good. To just kind of wrap things up on this continuous performance testing topic, my final recommendation as a technical tip to everyone, and then I'll pass it to you, James. First of all, just really get on to automation. Automate everything, and not just your virtual user scripts, but the entire process of running a test. Setting up the environment, setting up the test bed, the data, the app deployment, even monitoring. This is something you'll see in Performance Center and LoadRunner. The LoadRunners had the ability forever to auto kickoff, auto collate, auto analysis, and templates and generate. I mean, the testing process is very well automated in many of the mature commercial tools. Automate everything. Fire up the monitoring so that you're monitoring even in the dev environment so you can see what's going on. And automate the health of the test, right? So if the test is running, put some assertions in there that say if the error rate goes over a certain percentage, then abort the test when it gets ugly. And then also automate the collation of results and the cleaning up of the test bed and do this in an iterative fashion. So expand your scope for automation and don't be afraid to jump in with Jenkins. James, you brought this up. Just dive in, download a copy of Jenkins, or if you have Bamboo, just plug your tool into it. Usually anything with a command line interface is supported. You can just call out the WL-run-exe and run it. You can call JMeter at the command line in non-GUI mode, and you can run it. And that's a great way to just dive into the automation end of this and keep everything else we say in mind. But James, what are your other thoughts on tips?
Well, there are a few caveats on diving in. Mark, you mentioned anything with a command line interface can run. Most of these continuous integration frameworks have a standardized reporting format. So you need to be aware of what that format is and whether you need to modify the output of your tool in order to match it. And that comes into play for a very specific reason, because you need to insert checks in the continuous integration build, test, and deploy framework against that standardized reporting model in order to determine whether this piece of code actually continues in the build process. That process of checking for expected results against a standard is critical, because if you're not checking, you're not testing. All you're doing is automating in that case. And you want to implement these checks at every single possible stage. The earlier you can implement the checks and implement this kind of breakpoint system for if it doesn't meet the expectation, then we don't include it in the build. Actually, the higher your return on investment for automation, because the earlier you can automate, the earlier you can find a defect, the cheaper it is to fix. If it gets all the way to the performance integration stage, it's much more expensive to fix versus finding it in the unit stage or component assembly or even performance checks inside of functional testing before it gets to performance. And then finally, if it gets to security, it's even more expensive to fix there.
Yeah, as evidenced by people that are still finding blocking and locking issues in production, that may possibly, we could find some of them really early in the component level testing, unit level testing, if we can do some thread contention or query contention testing that's under load, or even small number of users or threads, but very concurrent kind of race condition testing. That would
Mark,
be good.
what do you have against deadlocks?
Deadlocks are easier to detect because everything comes to a screeching halt. Blocking is sometimes hard; it just shows up as a latency. I would rather have a deadlock than a block.
Okay.
Yeah, just a personal thing. Carlos, what are your...
To add my 2 cents to you guys, the only thing that I usually see from a performance engineering testing is the realization that most developers might not understand what you're talking about from a tip perspective, especially when you're trying to do what you're like using other tools and they're not familiar with that. If they're not familiar, be easy and be able to talk to them about it and what it's bringing to the table so that they will understand it instead of saying no. And it kills your progress with anything you might be trying to do. And there's a lot of people that are attached to their tool sets and how you can work with the others. They all give you similar data. It's how you present it to them.
Yeah, really good point. Really, very, very, very good point. PerfBytes listeners, once again, you've come to the close of a continuously automated episode of PerfBytes. And of course, James, Carlos, and myself would like to thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to the show today. James?
Mom, thanks for listening. I always feel great knowing there's one person out there listening.
Yes. Carlos would like to, thanks for joining us. Do you have anyone you'd like to give a shout out to and thanks?
Thank you guys for putting this great show together, and I'll be listening too, James. You can add me to that.
Thank you, Carlos.
Carlos should meet your mom. We could all go have lasagna. That would be nice. I'll also extend my thanks then to the sexy Irish voice of PerfBytes for being generally awesome and supporting everything I do on the show. We'd also like to thank our great sponsors, Flood.io and Cubic Load, for their sponsorship and support of the PerfBytes show and, of course, the PerfBytes community.
And Mark, today's episode is powered by the heat from our undersea volcano, which is attached to the PerfBytes secret lair, which of course is guarded by sharks with freaking laser beams.
Freaking laser attached to their heads, right? They can zap you.
Does it really matter, Mark? It's a laser beam.
I mean, as a shark is scary enough. I don't need laser beams attached to the shark. It's very superfluous, I think.
I think it just kind of completes the picture.
It does complete the picture. And, of course, remember that all the contents of this PerfBytes episode is copyrighted and protected by the same technology that's present in the UV sunscreen products at the equivalent of SPF 80 and is also water and sweat resistant for periods of time up to 90 minutes and may also increase your attractiveness to other people.
For more information about PerfBytes, please visit the show's website at www.perfbytes.com. or follow us on the Twitter and the Facebook. And, of course, you can always subscribe and listen to PerfBytes podcast on iTunes, TuneIn Radio, and Stitcher. Just open up your favorite listening app and search for PerfBytes. Click subscribe and be on your way.
Yes, and please keep in mind that the PerfBytes show and staff are supporters of the Practical Performance Analyst, the Performance Engineering Book of Knowledge, the Computer Measurement Group, the Workshop on Performance and Reliability, and, of course, the Software Test Professionals community of software testers. James and I hope to see you at the STPCon conference coming up in April. We will be there in New Orleans, right, James?
Exactly, and be sure to catch Mark at the TISQA conference on March 12th and 13th, and then at Test Bash 3 on March 28th in Brighton, UK. Then Mark will be off to Seattle, Minnesota, and eventually someplace warm called New Orleans, where he'll be at STPCon.
Yes, I'll wrap up all these international sojourns by meeting yourself. We'll have some single malt scotch and a live show. And, of course, don't forget about the PerfBytes 4th of July party. James is hosting in Monroe, North Carolina this 4th of July. It's going to be awesome. We'll have a live show. We're going to do some barbecue. We're going to do interesting libations from around the world. it'll be good.
Exactly, and don't forget to bring your notes on how to solve the 2020 problem.
How to solve the 2020 problem, and we did commit to having Scott Barber and Wilson Moore doing arm wrestling over some particular performance topic. The winner will be able to establish the industry norm based on that. Carlos, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. We'll catch you on the next PerfBytes. See you, everyone.
Have a great week.